peaks and dales. I think it's been greater over time. And then with our 3 years of consecutive drought in your congressional district, it's probably had some declines just like everything else.
But the numbers have increased or decreased in the last decade or so?
In the last decade, we went from very low numbers to very high numbers, 30s, 40,000s, and if we're in the 20,000 range now, it's kind of increased, decreased a little bit.
But even with a decrease now, are the numbers still higher than they were a decade
Yes.
ago?
Yes.
And that was without a listing, and the numbers have still increased?
Yes.
Well, what do you attribute that to?
Well, we believe it was to the federal program of the Conservation Reserve Program. A lot of those particular habitats, we've had a lot of Conservation Reserve acres, that's in my testimony, throughout the years, that we had a lot of habitat, a lot of voluntary conservation measures and managers out there providing that habitat.
What do you think response, and have you worked with a lot of farmers and ranchers over the last 20 years in your experience, what would be the response if there was a listing and instead of a voluntary, it all became mandatory? How helpful and interested in the progress of the lesser prairie chicken would Kansas farmers and ranchers be, in your opinion?
Well, Congressman, it's definitely a concern of mine. I believe the response will be pushing the other direction, to disenroll, to move the lands out of programs that were put there to benefit wildlife. And
yeah, and that would be my guess. There would be a reaction the other way, especially after all the progress that has been made, a tremendous amount of progress, without the federal government or the courts dictating this. When the settlement was reached between, in the courtroom, I think it was a secret agreement. When was the state of Kansas informed about this settlement for the requirement that a listing decision to be made by March?
I'd have to look at our testimony. It was early on, basically, when we were announced the notice of publication. When we were
you in the room when the settlement was made?
No, sir.
Do you know who was in the room?
No, I do not.
Do you think we should know who was in the room?
I think it would be important for the American public to know, yes.
Yeah. Do you think the state should have the authority to pre-approve these type of secret settlements?
I think the state should be involved in any settlement that affects their land.
Yeah. Recently, my office received an official notice from Fish and Wildlife Service saying that they intend to release the Topeka Shiner minnow. This was just last week, endangered species in Logan County, Kansas. Do you know what caused this, or who has the authority to do this, and was the state involved in this?
To release the minnow in a very, very arid climate, where are they going to put it? I guess would be my first question. Where are you going to find the water? We don't have a lot of surface waters in northwest Kansas. I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
We've had other reintroduction in Logan County with a black-footed ferret, but it's a different issue.
For folks that are, and Mr. Evans, you're obviously very familiar with this law. There is nothing in the law that would require or justify letting the state know that there's the intention, in this particular case, in a very dry, arid climate, to reintroduce a species that has not existed there for years.
It's very interesting, Mr. Congressman. I never heard this before. Generally, we know the law tries to do everything possible to notify everybody. I don't know what happened here in this specific detail, but of course it's a good idea for the state to know in advance, especially if this is an arid place like it is. And I'd like to know more detail because it sounds unusual in my whole experience.
And actually, in my experience, particularly in northwest Kansas, this is par for the course with Fish and Wildlife Service. As we demonstrated with the discussion of lesser prairie chicken, the intent to proceed ahead without notification, without working with local folks, without working with the state, I guess I was somewhat thankful. They've actually agreed to actually review the lesser prairie chicken reintroduction plan. But what is interesting, and I say this, and I apologize for going over time, Madam Chairman, but the director was asked about the fact that Kansas still has a hunting season on lesser prairie chicken because we've done such a good job, and was asked, do you plan on allowing the hunting season to continue in Kansas? And His answer was yes. I think everybody in the room thought that's the silliest thing we've ever heard. Of course, my constituents think the same. But the more silly answer was when asked about the fact that Kansas population's going down. Actually, the New Mexico or Kansas going up, New Mexico's going down. The director said, well, was asked the question, what about catching the birds in Kansas that you're going to hunt and instead releasing them in New Mexico? Would that help meet the goals of this listing? He said, we are considering that option. I mean, that's the foolishness that Kansans see in these approaches from Fish and Wildlife Services. We're making progress, Greg. I appreciate the efforts in Kansas. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
I might note that